What if I told you that, just 5 years ago, China was barely making a dent in the electric vehicle market? Back then, only around 5.4% of its car sales were electric. Respectable at first glance, until you compared it to places like Norway, where more than half of new car sales were already EVs. Even California alone had a higher percentage, and Europe was pushing stricter emission standards. At the time, it seemed like China was nowhere near claiming a leadership role in this field. Yet here we are. China is now not only the largest exporter of automobiles, but also a dominant force in the global EV industry. When the Chinese government once announced a target of having 50% of new vehicles be new energy by 2035, skeptics rolled their eyes. Because that target included hybrids, it suggested a slower pivot away from gas-powered engines. But fast forward to today, and China has blown past its own goals years ahead of schedule. By aligning policy, infrastructure, and real consumer buy-in, the country turned from an EV underdog to the industry's biggest success story, and it happened in around half a decade. China's journey toward EV dominance began with relatively unremarkable figures in 2020. A 50% electrification goal by 2035, especially counting hybrids, didn't exactly scream ambition when Norway was already past that milestone. Even with a massive domestic market, China's EV sector initially lacked the punch to compete with established international automakers. Then everything changed. By the mid-2020s, China began hitting and exceeding its targets at a pace few anticipated. Government policies tightened around fuel standards, leaving foreign companies struggling with stricter emissions rules and an expectation to ramp up zero-emission cars quickly. Meanwhile, Chinese brands like BYD and XPeng seized the advantage, propelled by government subsidies and a growing demand for vehicles produced at home. A big piece of this transformation was supply chain integration. Rather than waiting for global markets to dictate terms, China proactively invested in mining and processing critical materials like lithium and cobalt. This strategic approach ensured that when battery demand soared, local manufacturers could meet it without getting tied up in negotiations with external suppliers. By owning both resources and manufacturing, China positioned itself to leap ahead of foreign competitors. Today, China's EV production and exports are skyrocketing. The government's updated target of 45% new energy vehicles by 2027 was reached earlier than expected. A once slow crawl toward electrification became a full-on sprint, catching much of the world off guard. It's easy to label China's EV boom as pure central planning, but the real story is broader. Policy alone doesn't create a dramatic market shift. A perfect storm of policy, cultural change, and strategic investment does. Chinese policymakers saw the need to link industrial goals with national pride, making consumers genuinely enthusiastic to support homegrown EV brands. On the policy front, swift action came in the form of subsidies, tax breaks, and other incentives designed to benefit local EV makers. These weren't just handouts. Foreign automakers faced strict emissions rules they struggled to meet in time, allowing domestic brands already scaling up EV production to get a head start. Mastery over critical supply chains played a huge role too. By heavily investing in mines and refineries for lithium and cobalt, China secured a steady pipeline for battery production. Companies like CATL rose to global prominence, supplying both Chinese automakers and foreign brands that needed dependable, cost-effective battery cells. Consumer sentiment also changed quickly. Many Chinese drivers found domestic automakers more appealing, not just out of national loyalty, but because local EV brands seemed more innovative and better suited to local needs. Dealerships shifted focus the moment they saw the rising tide of EV demand, offloading gas-powered models and immediately stocking more electric ones. Instead of resisting, China leaned into the transition, which made things escalate even faster. If you're watching this and thinking, how did all this happen so fast? Hit that like button and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this kind of rapid shift could work in your country. While China was speeding ahead, the US and Europe found themselves trying to balance environmental goals with economic constraints. The Biden administration pushed the Inflation Reduction Act, pumping billions into EV production and infrastructure, alongside tougher emission standards. But these moves were often met with political debate and resistance from automakers worried about profitability and public acceptance. Different US states varied widely in policy, leading to a patchwork approach rather than a unified front. Europe faced its its own challenges. Many nations set ambitious targets, like banning new gasoline and diesel cars by 2035, but faced pushback from voters and industry groups wary of job losses and supply chain complexities. The European Union debated how to handle carbon tariffs and its reliance on imported battery materials. Meanwhile, China's top-down governance style let it enact large-scale changes with less pushback. That didn't make the transition seamless, but it did help streamline efforts. By the time Western governments intensified discussions on decarbonizing transportation, China had already solidified its lead as the world's largest EV exporter, shipping vehicles to any market willing to buy. China's fast rise in the EV world offers crucial lessons. First, setting clear, ambitious targets can spark real action if they're backed by resources. Norway's example proves the same. When they aimed to phase out gas car sales by 2025, they paired that goal with strong financial incentives, driving EV adoption rates above 90% for new sales. Second, embracing technological shifts rather than fighting them pays off. Once industries hit a tipping point, change can happen almost overnight, like the sudden shift from basic cell phones to smartphones. Countries or companies that hesitate risk losing market share and missing out on the economic upsides of leading a new tech wave. Finally, consumer sentiment can be a game changer. By tapping into both patriotism and genuine belief in local brands, China's EV makers nurtured a loyal base that embraced the switch to electric. When public support lines up with policy, transformations can unfold at breakneck speed. Regions still on the fence about going electric might find themselves left behind if they wait too long, especially as global demand for cleaner, smarter mobility continues to grow. China's leap from lagging behind other EV hotspots to setting global standards in under a decade is astonishing. By uniting government policy, strategic investment, and consumer excitement, Chinese automakers are now among the most prominent names in electric mobility, while Western markets wrestle with how to move beyond fossil fuels. This rapid change highlights how quickly global transportation can evolve when the right forces converge. The question now is whether other regions can, or even want to, catch up. For consumers, it could mean seeing more Chinese-made EVs that undercut or outperform familiar brands from Europe, Japan, or the US. For policymakers and industry leaders, the lesson is clear. Decisive, coordinated action creates massive momentum in a short span, and hesitating too long might cost you the next wave of technological and economic benefits. Debates about emission standards, tariffs, and infrastructure will continue. But right now, China holds the steering wheel, showing how rapidly a market can transform under the right conditions. That wraps up the whirlwind story of how China took the EV world by storm in just 5 years. You'll find all the sources and references in the description, so feel free to explore them for extra insights. If you enjoyed this deep dive, tap subscribe for more explorations of global tech trends and the rapidly changing future of transportation. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.